Welcome back to seminary, everybody. So we just finished the story of Amalickiah, and we learned about him Sunday and Monday. I wanted to make sure we really understand that story because that story really lays a groundwork for so much that is going to happen coming up. Okay, so today we are going to study chapters 50, 51, 52. We skip 53 today, and we do 54 and 55. We will come back to 53, but today we're going to skip it. We're going to start in verse 1, and it says, Moroni did not stop making preparations for war or to defend his people against the Lamanites. He did this because he realized that even though they had won, even though they had originally won the war, that those preparations that he made were not enough. You always have to be strengthening. You always have to be preparing. You always have to be kind of making yourself the very best you can be. And there's not ever a time you get to stop and just kind of sit and rest. And so in verse 6, it says, Moroni did prepare strongholds against the coming of their enemies. So that's very much like our lives, guys. There's always enemies, spiritual enemies in the world around us. There's always people that want to tear us down. Let me read verse 7. And it came to pass that Moroni caused that his army should go forth into the east wilderness. Yea, and they went forth and drove all the Lamanites who were in the east wilderness into their own lands. Here's why I like this, because I'm guessing those Lamanites in the east wilderness weren't probably doing a whole lot of damage right then. It wasn't like there was a large group of them necessarily, but Moroni knew that those people were going to cause contention and going to cause bad things in his life, and so he pushed them out of his land, out of his life. It's the same thing we have to do. Sometimes we do everything right, but there's just one or two little things kind of over here in the edge of our life that we kind of have that foothold into trying to stay into the popular crowd, or these little things that just kind of are still kind of the natural man, if you will. We have to push all those bad things out of our life because those little things slowly grow into big things. And that's what Moroni realizes. And that's why he pushes the Lamanites out of the land. Okay, so the Nephites begin to prosper. And it says in verse 18, they did prosper exceedingly, and they became exceedingly rich. Yea, and they did multiply and wax strong in the land. And in verse 23, there never was a happier time among the people of Nephi. I love these because they've just come through this horrible time. They just had 4 years of war, right? And it's a hard time. And yet they're recovering from it. And it says they never were a happier people. They're prospering, they're growing strong, they're multiplying, which means they're having babies and their families are growing. And they're having this wonderful, wonderful time. Even in this wonderful time, Moroni realizes that the wonderfulness will not last forever and his enemies are going to come back. And so he's still strengthening himself and still preparing himself. Because the people are growing and they're excelling and prospering in the land, they start getting more towns and building more cities, okay, so that the people can expand, right? Because you can't have all the people in one land. There's just too many people. So in this time, two of the lands that grow up is the land of Morianton and the land of Lehi. And it says they're kind of neighbors. Well, the land of Morianton wants to take over part of the land of Lehi. And people of Lehi are like, no. And so it says, a warm contention. I like the way that it says that. A warm contention began to grow among them, insomuch that the people of Morianton took up arms against their brethren. So I'm guessing it turned from warm to hot pretty quick if they're willing to take up weapons against them. The people of Lehi are afraid, and so they run to Moroni and say, look, these people are trying to steal our land. We haven't done anything wrong. We don't want them to take our land. They're going to come to war against us. What are we going to do? So Moroni says, I'll send some of my army down to protect you guys and to help squash this rebellion. Morianton is the leader of the people of Morianton, and he becomes afraid because he knows the army of Moroni is coming, and they obviously have a reputation for being amazing, right? So he makes preparations to take his people and flee northward, and that's going to be towards the land of the Lamanites. So he makes this plan. In the meantime, I want you to read verse 30, the end of verse 30. It says, Morianton, being a man of much passion, therefore he was angry with one of his maidservants, and he fell upon her and beat her much. And it came to pass that she fled and came over to the camp of Moroni and told Moroni all things concerning the matter. So he let his anger get the best of him. We talked about this a few weeks ago about bridling our passions, right? Maybe even last week when Alma was talking to Shiblon, I think it was, about bridling his passions. And so many times we talk about bridling our passions and it seems like it's of a sexual nature. And this was not. This is being a hothead, being overly passionate about something, letting his anger get the best of him, and he beat his maidservant. Because of that, all his plans are ruined because she goes and tells Moroni's army what's going to happen. So Moroni puts together a group of his army who is going to be led by a man named Teancum. And Teancum goes and cuts off the people of Moriantum from fleeing. And it says in verse 35 that a battle commenced between them, in the which Teancum did slay Morianton and defeat his army, and took them prisoners and returned to the camp of Moroni. So he gets the people and he brings them back. He's like, you know what? We're going to squash this rebellion. We're done with this. In the meantime, the chief judge Nephihah dies, and his seat now goes to his son Pahoran. And it says Pahoran wanted to be a good guy, and he's going to be a chief judge and governor over the people. We're in verse 39 here. And it says he took an oath and a sacred ordinance to judge righteously and to keep the peace and the freedom of the people, and to grant unto them their sacred privileges to worship the Lord their God. And Pahoran did fill the seat of his father. Okay, so he's a good guy and he wants to follow the rules and he wants to keep the people free and do everything that his father did. His father was a righteous ruler and he wants to be a righteous ruler. In the meantime, there's a group of people that want some of the laws changed. And Pahoran says, no, I'm not going to change them. These laws were established for a reason. We're not going to change them. In verse 4 in chapter 51 now, and it says, there arose a warm dispute, but not unto bloodshed. So they're angry at each other, but they're not drawing weapons yet. Those who were desirous that Pahoran should be dethroned from the judgment seat were called kingmen. And they were desirous that the law should be altered in a manner to overthrow the free government and to establish a king over the land. Okay, so now we're going to get a division. There's going to be kingmen and there's going to be freemen. The kingmen want to have a king over the land. The freemen want to keep the reign of the judges over the people and preserve their freedoms. The kingmen say, well, let's have a vote about it and let's see what everybody says. Okay. In the meantime, this is all happening. Amalickiah comes and it says in verse 9, Amalickiah had again stirred up the hearts of the people of the Lamanites against the people of the Nephites, preparing for war with all diligence. And it says, even Amalickiah did himself come down at the head of the Lamanites. So he is with his army this time. Most time he sends his army because it said in previous verses, he doesn't care what happens to his people. This time he's pretty sure he's going to win because he's prepared for war, right? And it says, those who are called kingmen heard the Lamanites were coming down. So we have the kingmen and the freemen. Amalickiah is coming down with the Lamanites. And the kingmen know the Lamanites are coming. And they're like, we're not going to fight. We're not going to help everybody. We're just going to let the Lamanites come and get everybody. Because we don't like the way things are being running. And so it says Moroni was exceedingly wroth because of the stubbornness of those people whom he had labored with so much diligence to preserve. So he's worked so hard to save these people and gone to war to save these people, and now they are basically throwing it in his face because they won't fight Amalickiah's army. And it says, the end of verse 14, his soul was filled with anger against them. So he has part of his army now down here, and he has to take part of his army to squash the rebellion of the kingmen and the freemen, because the kingmen are refusing to fight. They're causing contention. They're kind of the bad apple in the bunch, okay? And so he has to take part of his army to go against the kingmen to pull, it says verse 17, if you want to highlight this. Commanded that his army should go against those kingmen to pull down their pride and their nobility and level them with the earth. So he's going to compel them to be humble. You never want to be compelled to be humble. You want to humble yourself in and of yourself. Sometimes the Lord has to compel us. It's not a fun thing. And it came to pass that there were 4,000 of those dissenters who were hewn down by the sword. And those of their leaders who were not slain in battle were taken and cast into prison, for there was no time for their trials at this period. So the Lamanites are coming. Moroni has to take his army to squash this kind of civil war. And the Lamanites are coming and they're like, we don't have time to put y'all on trial. You guys are going to go to prison. We got to deal with the Lamanites. Okay. So because of that, Moroni had to take part of his army. His land is not strengthened, and the Lamanites are able to come and take over some of the lands. Okay, so I told you, so we have Teancum, who is the leader, right? And so Teancum is the leader of the army. Amalekite is in the land. The Lamanites are in the land, and it's a bad time, right? Okay, so the Lamanites and the Nephites come to war against each other, and they battle greatly. And it says they retired for the night. We're in verse 33. And it came to pass that when the night had come, Teancum and his servants stole forth and went out by night and went into the camp of Amalickiah. Behold, sleep had overpowered them because of their much fatigue, which was caused by the labors and heat of the day. Okay, so now Teancum stole privily into the tent of the king and put a javelin into his heart, and he did cause the death of the king immediately. So Teancum, who is the leader of part of Moroni's army, goes and he kills Amalickiah. We wish this would be the end, but unfortunately, when one bad guy dies, it seems like there's always another bad guy to step into his place. So Amalickiah's brother, Ammoron, takes over. Okay. In the meantime here, we're going to talk about the prisoners of war. As they're coming, they're capturing Nephites and they're capturing Lamanites and they're taking them as prisoners of war into their own camps. And it says Moroni caused that he should retain all the prisoners of the Lamanites as a ransom for those whom the Lamanites had taken. So Moroni's thinking ahead. He knows that the Lamanites are taking some of his people, and so he wants to have Nephites to exchange. Okay. Now, it says the Lamanites come over and they take over the city of Melech. And they leave an army there. And the leader of that army, his name was Jacob, and he's a Zoramite. Okay? And they're trying to get Jacob and his army to come out of Melech so they can take back over the land. And they know Jacob won't come out, and they're like, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? So, Moroni is so smart. I love this. He takes part of his army. Gets Teancum to take just a little part of his army and go down by the shore and pretend like he's going to attack. The Lamanites see this and they're like, we can take them. So they take a bunch of their army out of their fortress, which is the land of Melech, and they chase after Teancum. Teancum knows what he's doing, and so he retreats. He retreats towards Land Bountiful, where the army of Lehi is. In the meantime, Moroni has brought his army this way to surround Melech. So by the time Jacob and his army realize that they're getting close to the land of Lehi, they're like, crap, we got to go back. They turn around, they now see the army of Moroni, and they're now totally surrounded. Okay, so the Nephites are able to take back the land of Melech, and they take a bunch of prisoners of war. Okay? And it says, many were slain on both sides. Moroni was wounded, and Jacob was killed. Okay? So now Jacob's dead, but they still have all those people. And it says, now the number of prisoners who were taken exceeded more than the number of those who had been slain. Yea, more than those who had been slain on both sides. So there's a giant group of prisoners of war here. Okay, so now they're talking about exchanging prisoners of war. And they're trying to figure out how to do it. And it says, that Moroni talks to Amram, and he says, they start sending letters back and forth. And Moroni says, let's trade prisoners of war, because the Lamanites had taken women, men, and children as prisoners of war, which is against kind of war policy. The Nephites, however, had only taken the men of the Lamanites. And so Moroni says, if you're going to send them out, if we're going to trade, you're going to send a family out, a man, woman, and his children out for one of your prisoners of war. And throw down your weapons of war, all these other things. And Amram's like, I'm not going to throw down my weapons of war, and we're not going to retreat. He says, why don't you guys just give up and let me rule over you, and you guys can be our slaves? And Moroni's like, nope. And Amram says, but I will agree to switch out, because we need our food, we need our preparation, so we can get all these men back to strengthen our army. And Moroni says, I'm not going to give you all those men back. And he says, we'll figure out our own way. So he goes amongst his men and says, are there any Lamanites here among us? Okay, so it says that there was one among them, and his name was Laman. He was one of the servants of the king who was murdered by Amalickiah. You remember Amalickiah came up and he pretended, the king of the Lamanites came out and he pretended to go through the peace ceremony, but he had one of his servants kill the king. Okay, that original king, his servants have now joined the army of the Nephites. So he comes out and he takes a little group of people and he takes them over to the men holding the Lamanites, or the men holding the Nephites, where they're keeping all their prisoners of war. And he says, we escaped the Nephites and we stole their wine. And they're like, and he says, the Lamanites say, well, let us drink it. And they're like, oh, no, let's save until we defeat the Nephites. Well, that just made them want it all the more. They're like, no, we can have more wine later. Just drink it now. So it says verse 13, they did taste of the wine freely, and it was pleasant to their taste, therefore they took of it more freely. In verse 14, by and by they were all drunken. So they get drunk and they pass out. Moroni, he could have killed them, but it says he does not delight in bloodshed. This is verse 19. He does not delight in murder or bloodshed, but he delighted in the saving of his people. So he takes and he puts weapons into the hands of all the prisoners. He says he cast in weapons of war unto the prisoners, insomuch that they were all armed, yea, even their women and all those of their children, as many as were able to use a weapon of war. Okay, so he arms them. Now and then they back off and set their army around. So when the Lamanites wake up, they see the army around them. They look in and they see that all their prisoners of war are now armed also. And so they're afraid, and they're like, what are we going to do? And it says, their chief captains demanded their weapons of war, and they brought them forth and cast them at the feet of the Nephites, pleading for mercy. Okay, so they pled for mercy, and they're like, you know what? You can have us, you can take us. And so they have all these new prisoners now. So now the Lamanites have seen what's happened, and then they want to come and take back their prisoners of war, and they're going to try to trick the Nephites the same way that they were tricked. But it says in verse 31, the Nephites were not slow to remember the Lord their God in this time of their affliction. So every time the Lamanites or somebody gifted them something, it said that they would have their prisoners partake of it first, whether it was strong wine or they tried poisoning the wine. Hold on one second, babe. It says if their wine would poison a Lamanite, it would also poison a Nephite. And thus they did try all their liquors. Okay. So it says they continue to do that, and they continue to strengthen their strongholds. And thus ended the 29th year. Okay, when we started this, it was the 21st year. We have had 8 years of strong, heavy war now, guys. So these people have been really battered and bruised. Okay, tomorrow we're going to talk about the 2000 stripling warriors. I love this story. You guys are awesome. Have a good day.